So I'll go ahead and share my screen and we will get started. All right. Thank you all so much for joining our Sea Level Rise Vulnerability Assessment and Adaptation Plan workshop today. My name is Jane Thornton. I'm an associate planner here at the City of Coronado, and let's get started. So here on the meeting with us today is Rich Greneau, the city's Community Development Director, and our consultant team, which includes Chris Webb and Jake Thickman from our Moffitt and Nickel group, Brenda Dix from ICF, and Diane Leon and Ross Whitehead from PDC. Today we will have an overview of the city's sea level rise planning efforts, and we'll briefly describe the draft vulnerability assessment, which many of you may have already read, and then we'll dive into the newly released adaptation plan, followed by talking about the next steps for the project. We will have time for questions at the end, so feel free to add your questions to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen at any time, and we'll address as many as possible after the presentation. This meeting is being recorded, and the slides from this presentation, as well as the recording, will be available on the website next week. So with that, we will also have a couple of live polling breaks throughout the presentation. In order to participate, you will want to have your smartphone or electronic device handy and visit www.menti.com. From there, you will enter the code listed on your screen, which is 17693901. And this will direct you to a new page where you will be able to respond to the polls. So Diane will start us off with a few questions meant to get to know who's in our audience today, and then we'll dive into the meat of the presentation. Over to you, Diane.
Thanks, Jane. All right, time for our first polling break. What is your connection to Coronado? Looks like there's still a handful of you who haven't participated. Again, in order to participate, you'll want to have your computer or cell phone handy, and you'll visit the link menti.com and insert the code 17693901. Give you a few more seconds. All right, appears most of you live and work in Coronado, and another handful are interested in a regional dialogue on sea level rise. Next question. Have you reviewed the vulnerability assessment? All right, it looks like we've been split evenly. Some of you have reviewed the vulnerability assessment. That's great to hear that you've been following along with the project since its early stages. The other handful that haven't reviewed the vulnerability assessment, You can view those documents through our project webpage by visiting commentcoronado.org. Next question, have you reviewed the adaptation plan? All right, looks like majority of you haven't gotten the chance to review the adaptation plan. That's okay. We currently are in public review, so there is an opportunity to visit those documents online and get your input in by mid-May. All right, I'll turn it back to Jane with the presentation.
Great, thanks, Diane. It's really helpful to get a sense of where you all are at with reviewing the documents and jump back in. Okay, so as Diane mentioned, if you haven't had a chance to see these documents yet, they are available on Comment Coronado, and we'll show a link at the end of this presentation that brings you directly to that page. So this planning effort is funded by a Caltrans grant and consists of a two-phase approach. The first piece is the vulnerability assessment, which was released in June 2021, which uses a model to forecast projected impacts from sea level rise through 2100. The second piece of the project is the newly released adaptation plan, which includes a menu of potential adaptation strategies that are tied to observable sea level rise. The main purpose of this process overall is to look ahead roughly 80 years in order to be able to start to plan for potential sea level rise impacts and to aid land use and capital investment decisions moving forward. The documents apply only to the city jurisdiction, city facilities on port properties, and SR 75. Therefore, effective adaptation will require close coordination with other agencies. The document is informational only and creates no new regulations or obligations for the city at this time. Oops, sorry. Okay. So the combined vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan is a lengthy and technical document. The purpose of this meeting is to provide you all with some familiarity with the key findings and concepts from the documents. It is not the intent of this presentation to cover every aspect of the documents, so please feel free to add your questions to the Q&A box as we go on, or you can also reach out to me after this presentation for any other comments or questions you may have. So let's dive into a brief review of the vulnerability assessment. I'm going to go over this very quickly as we did do a full presentation on the vulnerability assessment last year, and it seems like many of you have at least had a look at the vulnerability assessment, but the recording from last year's presentation is also available on the website for reference. The vulnerability assessment was developed in 4 steps, which was to identify city resources, then to select scenarios and model them, overlay model results with resources, and analyze vulnerability. The vulnerability assessment studies sea level rise values in equal increments from 0.8 feet to 4.9 feet, or a quarter meter to 1.5 meters. It is important to note that the timing of when sea level rise may occur is uncertain, and the approximate decades are shown on the figure here. In the medium risk case, that central column, which is what the adaptation plan references, 0.8 feet of sea level rise has a 5% chance of occurring by 2030, and 4.9 feet of sea level rise has a 5% chance of occurring by 2110. The vulnerability assessment uses the USGS Cosmos model to map out potential sea level rise impacts. The model is considered the best available science for our area and is used throughout the coast of California. The maps depict 3 coastal hazards, which are shoreline erosion, temporary flooding during a 100-year storm, and inundation, which is areas of daily wetting associated with the spring high tide. The maps are broken up by area, and now we'll take a look at the results just for the long-term case, and the rest of the maps are available in the report itself. So in the north part of the city at 4.9 feet of sea level rise, there are large areas of inundation, which is shown in blue, especially in the low-lying Spanish Bight and Glorieta Bay areas. The beach doesn't lose a significant area because it is wide enough to migrate, and most of the flooding is actually coming from the bayside. So it may look quite concerning, but as a reminder, this scenario has a 5% chance of occurring at 2110 if nothing is done. In the central section of the city at 4.9 feet, there's inundation along some stretches of SR 75 and inland areas. And in the south part of the city at 4.9 feet, there's widespread inundation of Coronado Cays and inundation along select portions of SR 75. So based on the analysis and maps, stormwater outlets, roadways, especially SR 75, yacht clubs, and development in low-lying areas are the most vulnerable resources in the city. And resources that are the least vulnerable are generally not impacted at 4.9 feet. Such as the fire and police departments, or are highly adaptable, such as North Beach. And that about covers the main parts of the vulnerability assessment. Let's take a short polling break, and then we'll dive into the main part of the presentation about the adaptation plan. So over to you, Diane.
All right, next question is, are you worried about potential future sea level rise? Right, looks like we're even. Most of you are very concerned about potential future sea level rise, with about 45% somewhat concerned. Next question, is the threat to your property, quality of life, or other concern? Okay, looks like we're pretty close with you or your neighbor's property being the biggest threat, public safety, local economy, and quality of life. If you selected other concern, please identify that specific concern. Okay, some of these concerns involve shoreline width, regional implications of sea level rise, and maintenance of transportation facilities to assess military facilities. What areas of the city are you most concerned about? So this question is organized in a Wordle. So the input that's received will all be organized in a word cloud. And the words that appear the largest have most popularity, and those that are smaller were least expressed. So for this question, it appears that cays, beach are some of the biggest areas you are concerned about. Some other good areas are Yacht Club, SR75, Ocean Boulevard, the Strand. Lots of good input, and it still appears that Coronado Cays, we got the beach and ferry landing are the city's areas that you are most concerned about. All right, I'll turn it over back to Jane for the presentation.
Great. Thank you, Diane. It was great to see all the different areas that you all are concerned about. The adaptation plan does go over a lot of the areas that you all talked about. So we'll go into some examples of those adaptation strategies now as we jump into the draft adaptation plan. So the newly released adaptation plan includes a menu of potential adaptation options for citywide implementation, as well as location-specific ideas. A key feature of the plan is that all of the potential measures are tied to trigger points or observable sea level rise, rather than to specific dates, since there's a lot of uncertainty regarding when sea level rise may occur and how severe it might be. Above all, the plan emphasizes the importance of coordination with our neighbor agencies, because in reality, the city only controls about 5% of the coastline. You can see on the figure here that the land shown in black is owned by other agencies, and the white area is what the city owns. So the city doesn't have any land use authority over the blacked out areas representing that land owned by other agencies. The potential citywide strategies are grouped into 5 strategy types, starting with adaptive management, which includes ongoing monitoring of sea level rise and joining FEMA's community rating system. Next is an engineering action, which includes developing sea level rise design guidelines for all city development. And citywide operational strategies consist of enhanced flood warnings, a system to track sea level rise impacts and costs to the city, and updating emergency planning documents as needed. In the planning category, there are recommendations to seek adaptation funding, incentivize private retrofits, and update zoning standards. Finally, robust public outreach is recommended throughout. The adaptation plan also includes location-based strategies for 10 action areas. There are 5 categories of adaptation strategies for the action areas, which are hard engineering, nature-based solutions, operational, planning, or managed retreat strategies. So I'm not going to read this full slide, but some of the types of hard engineering strategies include elevating infrastructure, constructing flood walls or levees, installing building retrofits, and installing sand retention features. Our website for this project has a fact sheet that you can download that includes all of the descriptions that you see on your screen now. And the full adaptation plan itself includes very detailed cut sheets for each of these strategies if you'd like to learn more. Nature-based solutions include beach nourishment, dunes, or constructing floodable parks. And operational strategies could be things like temporary closures, deployable flood control barriers, sandbagging, or a flood alert system. Planning strategies include special assessments or redevelopment restrictions, and managed retreat could be a government buyout program, or a more natural approach where after repeated property damage or loss of infrastructure, individuals could choose to leave on their own. So as I mentioned, the adaptation plan identifies 10 specific action areas, which are shown on the screen here. And then each action area includes near-term priorities and long-term strategies based on those types that we just covered. The near-term priorities focus on coordination with neighboring agencies. They also include operational measures or lower cost strategies. And the long-term strategies are larger scale projects such as elevating streets. Each action area has a very detailed chapter in the adaptation plan that recaps the vulnerability for that area and provides a written description of all the possible strategies, as well as what are called adaptation pathways. So let's take a look at a couple examples of those adaptation pathways now. So on this slide, we have an example of an adaptation pathway from the first action area, which is from the edge of NASNY to Harborview Park. I'd like to give a brief overview of how this graphic is set up as it appears many times throughout the report. The first column includes all of the strategies recommended for the area, with the first step in every action area being to coordinate with appropriate stakeholders. The second column is the trigger, which is when planning for the strategy should begin. The trigger is usually reaching a certain amount of sea level rise, such as 0.8 feet. And at the top of the graphic is the timeline for when the levels of sea level rise may occur. Importantly, those dates are from that medium sea level rise case that we talked about during our review of the vulnerability assessment, which is a 5% chance of that amount occurring by the decade shown. Within the central part of the graphic, the circle represents the trigger, the dotted line represents planning time, and the triangle represents the point by which the strategy should be implemented, with the solid line being the length of time that the strategy remains effective afterwards. For this action area, short-term actions are to coordinate with the Navy and to update zoning codes, while example long-term city actions could include elevating First Street and installing flood walls along NASNY. One note on this action area in particular is that it only includes projects that could feasibly be done on city land, and it doesn't include ideas for Navy-owned land. Our hope is that by coordinating with the Navy right away, we could come up with a more holistic approach that would not necessarily require some of the later projects shown here. As another example, some action areas have multiple pathway options. For the K's areas, there are 2 long-term adaptation pathways that could be considered. So option 1 is an engineering approach focused on elevating existing seawalls and roads where and when necessary, while option 2 is an eventual managed retreat approach focused on providing residents with fair market value for their homes. And the report also includes a combined approach, starting with some of the engineering options and then moving on to the managed retreat approach further on. You can see here that there are several strategies that are also the operational strategies, which are shown in blue, and that planning for engineering strategies could occur starting at 0.8 feet of sea level rise. So there's a lot of detail here, and in the interest of time, we won't go through this graphic line by line, but the point is that every action area in the adaptation plan has these pathways, and we invite you all to look through the ones that you might be interested in when you take a look at the full plan. The next steps for this project is to collect as much public input as possible during our 60-day review period, which we're in the middle of now, and it goes until May 18th, excuse me. So once we've completed that review period, we hope to bring updated documents to City Council in early summer. If you're interested in reading the full report, it is available at our Sea Level Rise planning page on cometcoronado.org/sea-level-rise. As well as the full reports there, as well as the fact sheet that I mentioned. And I invite you to provide comments to me directly by email or by phone. So now I want to open up some time for questions. Diane's going to read the questions and we'll do our best to answer all of them. So feel free to add as many questions as you can think of to the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. Stop sharing for now.
For the first question, is from Kim. You mentioned that flooding in the village will most likely happen on the bay side. Won't this also be true for Coronado Caves? If so, what will be done to combat SLR from the bay side?
Yes, so that is correct. Most of the flooding for the entire city of Coronado, including the Cays, is coming from the bayside rather than the ocean. So those on that map where we showed the impacts to Coronado Cays, that is coming mostly from the bayside. So that adaptation pathway that we showed had the two different approaches, whether that be an engineering approach or a managed retreat approach that could be considered moving forward. Hopefully that answers your question.
Kim also asked, how do we know that Coastal Commission will allow the construction of lots of seawalls?
Yeah, moving forward, that would definitely be a discussion with Coastal Commission. We do know that nature-based solutions are most preferred, so we've tried to include as many nature-based or hybrid solutions. And I think also we have the benefit of having the Navy here, so the need to protect their land is maybe very critical and may give some sway with the Coastal Commission, but that's a discussion that we'll have moving forward as we reach the different levels of sea level rise. Not sure if anybody wants to add anything else to that. But if not, we can go on to the next question.
Right, the next questions are pertaining to the Navy. What are the Navy's plans for sea level rise, and what is that process of coordinating with them?
Okay, yeah, those are great questions. So we've been coordinating with the Navy so far, keeping them updated on these documents. They're closely reviewing them. The Navy doesn't yet have a document addressing their properties here on Coronado for sea level rise. That is something that they are thinking about and working on, but moving forward, I think that will be a greater discussion once they've also had a chance to study. So they're aware of everything that we've done, and we've been talking to them, and we hope to continue that. I think Rich has something more to add as well.
Yeah, Jane, I wanted to add that it's my understanding the Navy is currently working with SANDAG to prepare a sea level rise study for NASNY. And I think that is supposed to be out sometime this spring or early summer. So they are working concurrently, and we will, of course, continue to try to coordinate closely with our regional partners.
Yes, thank you, Rich.
Next question, how is the city coordinating with Caltrans on SR 75?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, this is a Caltrans funded project. So a part of the project was that they wanted us to look very closely at SR 75. So that is included as one of the action areas. So we've included a number of potential adaptation strategies for SR 75. And Caltrans is also involved in that study that Rich mentioned that the Navy is working on with SANDAG. So Caltrans is also aware of that and reviewing that document as well. So they're mainly reviewers on both of those documents, and will be sharing their input on some of these adaptation thoughts and options.
Thanks. The next questions pertain to the California Coastal Commission. Has they been involved in that process, and will the adaptation plans be subject to their review and approval?
So this document is optional by the city. It's not required by Coastal Commission. They have had a chance to take a look at the vulnerability assessment and have been sent the adaptation plan as well. So we welcome their comments. But it's not subject to their approval per se, although will integrate as many of their thoughts as we can moving forward as well. I will also add to that question that we are using the best available science for California right now. So most of the recommendations from Coastal Commission and their guidance for sea level rise matches what we're doing for the most part in any case. So
Next question. Although Coronado doesn't control Navy activities, do you have maps showing the SLR threat to Nassau Oceanside?
So our maps, the maps that we have do show the potential impacts of sea level rise to the Navy properties and to port properties. Although we didn't look, when we did the maps, we looked very closely at City of Coronado to make sure that the maps were correct, and have we actually ended up going in and having to change a little bit about them because it didn't capture all of the topography or special features that the city has, such as the seawall on Ocean Boulevard. We did not do that for the Navy in particular. So if they have any protection that wasn't automatically in the model, we haven't added that in, but our maps don't exclude the sea level rise impacts to their properties. So you are able to take a look at the maps, and you should be able to see impacts to the Navy on those maps as well, and to port properties as well. Hopefully that answers your question. If not, feel free to add in more to the question box.
Next question. Which storm drains are below high tide, and what are the plans to adapt?
So all of the maps, we do have the storm drains mapped out as a part of the vulnerability assessment. Some of them are below high tide. So there is a section in the adaptation plan for stormwater specifically. It's its own action area, and many of the actions include to address those that are below high tide already or moving forward, to make sure that there's backflow protectors and other adaptation strategies there. So there is a section, like I said, right in the adaptation plan that's devoted to stormwater in particular.
Next question. If flood walls are installed at low points around city Navy property, is there a concern that flooding will just be redirected to adjacent properties?
I'll jump in for that one. That's a good point. If we were ever to build some kind of hard engineered seawall or revetment or something like that, that would be a normal part of the process, would be to study before it was installed to make sure that there weren't unintended consequences, redirecting wave energy or water soft site properties. But that's a very good point.
Yeah, thank you, Rich, for jumping in.
Next question. Has Coronado seen or considered the same ideas that are implemented in Galveston, Texas? They are planning a seawall which could take 2 years to implement.
I'm not familiar with the specific project that you might be referring to, but our adaptation pathways, the way they're set up is they've built in planning time. So the trigger point for all of the suggested adaptation actions are for when we should begin planning for. So in those graphics, we'll show when you begin planning and when you implement. And so for the most part, for those bigger projects like seawalls or elevating infrastructure, there's several years of planning time, or however that shakes out to be with the amount of sea level rise, how quickly it's rising. But yes, there should be time. Rich, was there anything you want to add to this one?
I just wanted to sort of comment that 2 years might be something that's attainable in Texas, but in California, that would be lightning fast. I think anything that we would build that would be in the sea, some kind of seawall or something, we'd have to get permits from Coastal Commission, lots of entitlements. And as Jane said, there would be lots of planning, design, and permitting schedule that have to be committed to that to make it happen.
Thank you.
Next question. Is the plan able to pivot if SLR increases more quickly? Projections have changed. NOAA shows greater SLR for Coronado.
Yeah, so the The plan isn't tied to, the plan is tied to observable sea level rise rather than to specific dates. And that's exactly why we did that. We wanted to be able to be flexible, given that it's uncertain how quickly sea level rise will happen, and that science is constantly changing. Maybe Chris or Jake can talk a little bit more about those findings, the recent ones from NOAA. My understanding from those findings is that they're projecting that sea level rise will be slower in the near term and then speed up in the future. So it's actually showing less for Coronado in the near term and more in the future, but it also eliminates some of the very, very high sea level rise projections. So they may be able to comment more on that, but I think the main point is that the sea level rise projections are constantly changing. And so that's why we wanted to make the adaptation plan highly adaptable. So if it does happen more quickly, as soon as we hit 0.8 feet, for example, of sea level rise, we'll start looking at some of those strategies that we've identified for that, whether that be in 5 years or whether that be in 10 years or 15 years. Chris, is there anything you want to add about those projections?
Yeah, I'd like to add that Jake Thickman can answer that question really well. So Jake, why don't you step in and do so?
Yeah, Jane, I think you nailed it there with the recent NOAA report. They do come to that conclusion of slower at first, but potentially accelerating toward the end of the century. They have gotten rid of their extreme scenario, which was 2.5 meters of global sea level rise by the end of the century. Their highest is now 2 meters for the Southwest by the end of the century. But like you mentioned, if observable sea level rise does track down that path, these trigger points could allow for whatever adaptation measures to be implemented, along that timeline. So, I think our plan goes up to 4.9 feet, which is just about there. And it has the ability to change over time to match as projections evolve.
Thank you, Jake. That's super helpful. Hopefully that answers your question, Amy. Not, feel free to add more in. And Diane, I think we can go on to the next one.
How is the city coordinating with the port and finding ways to adapt and help pay for adaptation in our public tidelands?
Yeah, so similar to the Navy, the city, we have been coordinating with the port, state parks, the Navy and Imperial Beach, and keeping the conversation open, sharing our work thus far. Because this document doesn't commit the city to any specific steps, we haven't had any kind of commitment necessarily. We're not providing, and we're also not suggesting any adaptation for their land owned by the port. This document really only has adaptation strategies focused on land that the city owns, because we can't do anything on land that we don't own. So moving forward, we do plan to have continued meetings with the port and find ways that we can collaborate, same as with the other jurisdictions as well. And maybe Rich can add more to that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add a little bit of commentary to that. In my view, Coronado's geography presents some kind of unique challenges and opportunities. On one hand, as Jane mentioned during the overview, we only control about 5% of our coastline. So the city council in Coronado would not be able to act on their own necessarily to implement some adaptation features. We're going to have to coordinate with the Navy, state parks, and the port, which could complicate matters. You're going to have a couple of different governments working together, and that may make things a little bit more difficult at times. The upside, though, I think, is that collectively we're stronger, and our regional partners are bigger than Coronado. The Navy and the port are pretty well resourced, as the state of California. So the hope is that collectively we can tackle these really difficult projects better together. I also want to touch on the idea of paying for it, because that is going to be a significant concern for coastal communities around the United States if and when sea level rise comes to pass. The magnitude of the issues is probably going to be outside the reach of any local city. There's going to need to be state or federal funding, sort of a consortium of affected agencies that come together. And we're going to have to figure out ways to finance this. It can't be borne on local governments. It's unreasonable to tax the residents to pay for, improvements that will easily go into the billions of dollars. So that is going to be an enormous challenge for sea level rise, not just for Coronado, but for California and really coastal communities throughout the country. So as time moves on, that's going to be a big policy matter.
Thank you, Rich.
Carrie asked, do you have any examples of any seawalls being approved along the California coast?
Yeah, maybe Chris or Jake may have some specific examples. There's a lot of planning going on right now, vulnerability assessments, but not as much adaptation planning happening quite yet. So maybe Chris or Jake, you all know specific examples of seawalls being approved?
So before we go to specific ones, I can answer more generally that seawalls are built all the time throughout California. The California Coastal Commission takes land use authority on seawalls within the coastal zone, which is pretty much anywhere you put a seawall. Their policy is that if it's to protect existing development, there's usually a permitting path to build a seawall. If it's to protect new development or development that doesn't exist, that's where they get a little bit more squeamish and will push back and oftentimes, either deny or heavily condition those projects. But seawalls have been an effective tool to protect property for, forever. And it's going to continue to be one of the main methods to do so. But, in terms of specific ones, if there's a major project, I would look to Jake or Chris if they know of a major one, not just something that's, designed to protect a single individual, single family property or something.
We know of one in particular that was in Malibu. It was installed on an emergency basis in 2010, I think it was, and it protects approximately 125 homes over a reach of beach about a half mile long. I think one or two homes opted out of it. And since it was installed on an emergency basis, the Coastal Commission conditioned it retroactively with some pretty significant conditions, basically to bury it with sand, put a beach in front of it, and keep the beach in front of it into perpetuity. So that's the kind of thinking that was associated with that one. I can't think of another one as an example of a significant one, though.
Hopefully that answers your question, Carrie, and we can always get back to you if you want some more details on the project that Chris has shared. I think we can move on to the next question then for now.
Stephanie asked, when will the city start to develop preliminary budgets for the various adaptation plans?
So the adaptation plan itself actually has very high level costing for the different adaptation strategies that are suggested. So there is already some thought process within the plan about how much these different strategies could cost. Now, I want to caveat that with that being in today's dollars, and of course down the line it may be a lot more expensive, and also the projects, like I said, are very high level, so without going into all of the design details, it was really difficult to come up with costs for those projects. But high level, they are already in the adaptation plan, and then moving forward as the different adaptation strategies are considered, if and when sea level rise occurs, at that point, that's when the budgets would be more developed as well. And the document also does include some potential funding strategies. You can do the next question.
How will the SLR vulnerability assessment and adaptation plan affect ongoing infrastructure design projects in Coronado and along SR 75? Will each of the projects require its own SLR analysis?
Yeah, so one of the suggestions in the adaptation plan is that for city projects moving forward, we may develop some sea level rise guidance. So I'm not sure if it would necessarily take the form that every single project would have its own sea level rise analysis, but perhaps the guidelines will have some general high level things that each project might look at before it has to dive into a deeper analysis. So at this point, that's a pretty detailed approach, but we do think that there's some benefit to having future projects at least take a look at the potential impacts. And I see Brenda's turned on her screen, so she may have some additional comments about that.
Yeah, I think you nailed, got it right on, Jane. I wanted to just add that in the adaptation plan, there are some examples of some other municipalities that have come up with similar guidance. In several of those cases, they set a minimum threshold for project value. So projects over X dollar value are probably going to be around for a long time and represent a significant investment. Those are the ones that usually go through these analyses. So it's not a burden on any small little project that's just maybe maintenance or something, but is considered in bigger, more significant ones. So I think we would envision or are recommending something similar in this situation.
Great, thank you, Brenda, that's helpful. And I think we can do the next question.
Is Coronado more likely to be affected by an earthquake-generated tsunami than our neighbors in OB, La Jolla, or Oceanside?
So, sorry, Jane, I'll jump in. I'm probably gonna have to turn to Jake, Brenda, or Chris to see if they know more. I don't know a ton about tsunamis. I think the one benefit Coronado could have is at least in the village part of town, our beaches are very wide, much wider than those other communities. But if you have an Indonesian style tsunami, my guess, and I'll ask the scientists to confirm or refute this, is we're all in trouble.
Hi, Rich. Pretty good answer because that's the truth. This is a regional type thing. And so all coastline basically is equally vulnerable to a tsunami that's coming from a distant source. It's the lower lying locations that are more prone to flooding and damage, such as potentially Coronado, Ocean Beach, and probably less of bluff-backed and higher areas, potentially such as La Jolla and even portions of Oceanside that are up high, but a lot of Oceanside's down low. So I think it's low-lying areas are more vulnerable than higher areas would be my answer to that.
All right, thank you, Rich and Chris. Diane, let's do the next question, please.
How is the SLR tied to the climate action plan?
I'll take this one too, Jane. They're very complementary. Obviously, the sea level rise is projected to occur because of increased greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, warming the earth, and then we get more glacial melt and the sea levels consequently rise. So there's certainly a link there. I think where they diverge is that the sea level rise study is looking at just one part of the effects of climate change. So our climate action plan is looking more at trying to reduce the causes of climate change, trying to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and the ways that we can do that, and then hopefully minimize the consequent impacts that would result. So that's how they are alike and a little bit different. But if you do have something more specific you'd like to ask about, fire away and we'll do our best to answer. It looks like Brenda can help me out here.
No, I think you did a good job, Rich. I just wanted to also point out that although the city of Coronado is taking actions to reduce emissions through the climate action plan, we can't assume that globally everyone is going to be taking similar actions. And so we don't want to assume that if Coronado does a good job, that means there's going to be less sea level rise, because sea level rise is really driven by global emissions. And that's what we're trying to take into account, is that range of possibilities that Jane walked through that we could see at a global scale that results in localized sea level rise.
Yes, thank you, Brendan, Rich, and Brenda. I was almost thinking to jump in with that same information that regardless of the city's climate action plan, unfortunately, we're just such a small part of the world. And yeah, global emissions are part of how the projections for sea level rise are made. So as much as we can reduce on our end, won't necessarily impact the speed of sea level rise in Coronado. I think we can move on to the next question.
Right. Isn't there a downside to joining the community rating system if Coronado does not adopt sufficient floodplain management?
I think Brenda can help a little bit with this one. We're not eligible to join the community rating system, as far as I understand, until the FEMA maps are updated to show that we are prone to sea level rise. I don't believe that they currently include that. But Brenda, maybe you can talk a little bit more about the ability to join the community rating system.
That's right, Jane. You're not currently eligible, but we do anticipate that over time, FEMA will update their sea level rise mapping to incorporate both observed sea level rise as well as projected sea level rise. But the community rating system, what that does is really enables city level activities to reduce the flood insurance premiums that Coronado residents would then have to pay if they were within those flood prone areas in FEMA's maps. So it's really a benefit to the community. It's a carrot-based system to encourage action rather than a stick to provide any downsides. So I view it as a very win-win strategy.
Thank you, Brenda. I think that's very thorough. Let's do the next question.
From what baseline is SLR measured?
Yeah, that's a good question. Jake and Chris can give the very technical answer. I believe there is a datum called NAV-D88, which is described in our vulnerability assessment. So that's the 0 point, but Jake and Chris, maybe you can give us the layman's answer for that.
Yeah, I think we use that datum to reference our elevations too, but in terms of where the sea level rise increase is measured from, that would be the baseline year 2000. And they obtained that from taking the average of all readings from 1991 to 2009 to capture any fluctuations that occur due to different cycles that affect the tide over time. Everything, all the projections in the report are measured from a year 2000 baseline.
And I just wanted to add that might seem a little out of date sitting here in 2022, but that is the baseline that's used in that best available science and that mapping from USGS that was used in the vulnerability assessment. So it's very much in line with what others are using in the state and best practices.
Great, thank you.
How will SLR affect bridge traffic?
So it could impact, I guess, just thinking off the top of my head here, it could impact bridge traffic if there is a storm and people are trying to leave. I don't know if it's there.
Well, I think I'll jump in. The sea level rise vulnerability report did not project that we were going to have permanent inundation on the landing of the Coronado Bridge coming into Coronado. However, there could be an effect because SR 75 is affected. So if something happened where SR 75 no longer could carry the current traffic load and the capacity it does today, that would divert more traffic to the bridge, or if we had expanded ferry service or something. So there could be an indirect effect that way. Should projections prove to be understated in our report and sea level rise accelerates and happens much more intensely than we forecasted, then you could get in a situation where the bridge is compromised, and that could certainly have adverse impacts. But that's not the science that we're seeing right now.
Great, thank you, Rich.
Last
Yeah,
question. Are the climate action plans able to address a potential tsunami from elsewhere? When the Tonga tsunami caused a 5-foot high wave that Coronado had to deal with, it was reported that Mission Bay had more flooding than Coronado.
So the Climate Action Plan Sea Level Rise study neither look at tsunami impacts. And I think there's a few reasons for it. One is if you have a major, well, the range of impacts from a tsunami widely varies. You know, you could have them, we have small earthquakes that create tsunamis sometimes that aren't even really noticeable to people. And again, if you have something that's on the scale of what happened in Indonesia some years ago, you know, there's not much you can do to prepare for that. That's going to have, you know, very severe consequences on the population and infrastructure. You know, you can't seawall your way out of that problem. So that is not something that is looked at with either Climate Action Plan or Sea Level Rise adaptation plans.
Thank you, Rich. So I think that was the last question, and we're coming right up to our time. So I want to thank everybody for participating today. I'm going to put my contact information here on the screen. I know that was a lot of content, so feel free to reach out to me. Again, our comment period is until May 18th. So if you have any questions or just want to walk through the adaptation plan a little bit more or want to share your comments, feel free to either call or email me, and we will be, you know, taking into account all the comments that we receive and addressing them throughout the plan before we bring it forward to City Council in early summer. So again, thank you all so much for your time this evening, and I look forward to hearing from you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.